of nicknames in Rogers City in the early days. It was compiled by Bill Schultz Jr. and myself. Now, Bill was a neighbor of ours in the early day, lived just next to the Valentine house. And he later became a teacher at the Cranbrook School, private school in Bloomfield Hills. And he was the man who donated the beautiful planetarium that we have here in the old high school building. He donated it years afterwards in memory of his parents. Five or 6 years before I did, and he was really one of the first scoutmasters that I had. He worked along with a Reverend Belfry, who was the first minister of the new Presbyterian Church, the Stone Church, and he helped organize the Boy Scouts here in Rogers City. He went to the University of Michigan. Summers he worked here at the local printing company for Hal Whiteley. And he graduated. In fact, he graduated from the University of Michigan before I graduated out of high school. I had known him, of course, knew his family, and his younger brother Ed and Ernie, of course, were contemporaries of mine, and visited his home very, very frequently. But to get back to this story, Bill, after he graduated from the University of Michigan, became a teacher. First job that he got at the Cranbrook School, which was a private school in Bloomfield Hills just out of Detroit. The institution is still there and it's well known. And he got hired into the science department and had spent his whole career there teaching in that institution. In his later years, and of course I might say that he had a summer home up here, up near Sacred Rock, and he brought his family up here practically every summer that he would come up. And I saw him practically every summer, and we always stopped and chatted, or he came into the office to see me. And I know that on two occasions when I was going to the University of Michigan, long after about 1939 or 1936 to 39 when I was going there, Bill would be there in the summer times, and he would be taking some advanced courses, and he at that time would invite me over. His wife was also staying in Ann Arbor, and we had he invited me over for some meals. I enjoyed that very much. Well, later after Bill retired, he moved. Of course, he retired in that area, but he always came up here summers. And one time when we were along Main Street here in Rogers City just talking, I was still working, somebody came by and Bill called him by his nickname, and somebody else came by that I knew and I called him by their nickname. And he said, Harry, he said, he said, during the time I remember a lot of nicknames of people in my era around here. And he said, you do too. He said, I tell you what we'll do. He said, I'll make up a list of all the nicknames that I know of around here from the time that I was a kid and what people told me. And you make up a list of all that you know. Now, he said, these are just nicknames. He said, we'll take men only, no women. And he said, we won't mention any last names, just the first name of these people, the nickname that they had. And he said, then we'll compare notes. And he said, after we get a certain number of those in there, he said, I'll take it down to Hal Whiteley and we'll publish it just for the heck of it. And he said, a lot of people will recognize the nicknames, but he said, we won't tell anybody what, who the family was. And so that's what we did. I made up a list, he made up a list. We got together, we compared them, we swapped them, and we did that 2-3 times. Now, we're just about ready to take it over to Hal Whiteley to have it published, just for the heck of it, when Bill died. And so I didn't have only half of the list, and of course he had the other half. I questioned some of his boys afterwards, some of his sons, but they didn't know anything about that list at all. And so, but I, of course, remembered a good number of the ones that he told me. Now, of course, these were the names of people who were around town at that time. And the names that they had are somewhat really comical as all get out, but they usually came out of some characteristic of that particular person. Now, I know that you shouldn't make fun of anybody for their physical characteristics, but if a guy had a great big nose, kids probably called them schnoz and stuff like that. Just this is all in good humor. I mean, that's what this is. So here are some of the names that, as I remember them at that time, and they'll bring you'll recognize some of these, especially the kids in the family. Will remember them, like Ernestine and Treese and Grace and George. Will remember a lot of these people, and then of course, I got some of them. I'll admit that I got some of them from my dad. I got some of them from my mother, and then I asked other people about which ones that they remembered, because I couldn't remember them all, but there certainly is a good assortment. Here we go. Now these are people in Rogers City. These are actual people who lived here at that time. Now I do know that every town, every small town especially, had nicknames for the kids of their era. That's as common as can be. But in a small town, of course, you knew these people. And in a big city, of course, you might know the nicknames of a few people in your immediate area. But if you were going to a high school of 400, 500, 600 kids, or 1,000 kids, you naturally didn't remember too many of them except in your immediate area. So here we go. Here are some of the Rogers City nicknames from years ago. These fellows start right in. There was a guy named Chief. There was a fellow named Beans. A fellow named Buzzer. And a fellow named Mose, M-O-S-E. There was a fellow named Schnapps. Now, Schnapps is the derivation of whiskey. There was another fellow named Fish. Another fellow that we called Fish Gut. And there was a fellow called Sour Face. And a fellow called Booger. And another fellow called a Hooch. Hooch is whiskey. And there's a fellow called Half Shot. Now these are good ones. Here's a fellow called Dong. There's a fellow called Dingling. And here's another fellow called Big Dong. And here's a fellow called Pinhead. And here's a fellow called Spitzer. Well, that's taken off the card game. Here's a fellow called Half Tank. Potlicker. Sucky. Farts. Isn't that a dandy? Knucklehead. Schnabel. Jumbo. Here's a fellow called Mox. The real name was Max. I remember they just called him Mox. And a fellow called Jute, J-U-T-E. And here, a fellow called Lardass. And here's a fellow called Westy. And here's a fellow and there's a fellow called Mole. A fellow called Potlicker. I guess we had that one before. A fellow called Sack, S-A-C-K. And a fellow called Strip. And a fellow called Haas, H-A-A-Z, I suppose. That means rabbit. And a fellow called Mooney. And PK. And Whippy. And Ducky. And Abe. And Pudge. And here's another fellow called Ossie. And Pecker. And Mutts. And Jigs. And Tots. And Skinny. And Stinky. And Toots. And Kaiser. And here's a fellow called Punchy. And Stony. And Fats. And Wobble Knocker. Isn't that a beautiful name? Wobble Knocker. And then actually, I knew the guy. And when I talked to the Kiwanis, one said, well, I remember Wobble Knocker. There's Running. There's Frenchie. And there was Bunny. And there was Rook, R-O-O-K. And there was Penny. And there was Fiend. And then there was Ping. And there was Boozy. And there was Tubby. And there was Tree. And Nuts. And Jerk. And Tex. And Tie. And Coon. And Slim. And there was Jock. And there was Deke. And there was Bart. And there was Chucky. And there was Scurby. And there was Big Louie. And there was Andy. And there was Gump. There was Smokey. There was Gas. There was Fritz. And there was Stosh. Stosh is the Polish for Stanley. And Shine. And there was Slates. And Hammer. And Sparrow. And High Pockets. And Jabber. And Pepper. And Biffer. And Jeff. And Juice. And Blinky. And Cocker. And Feathers. This kid lisped a little bit, and I remember he talked about the feathers on the chicken. He said the feathers on the chicken. And there was Slick, and there was Rooster, and there was Bergie, and there was Scratch, and there was Daggy, and there was Bling, B-L-I-N-G, and there was Turd and Ziggy, and there was Spigot, and there was Couts, and then there was Coots, and there was Stump, and there was Shorty, there was Rabbit, and there was Cow, Hirsch. Hirsch is a deer in German. Jude, Stony. Some of these might be repetitious. And there was Rube, there was Whiskers, there was Chink, there was Peg, there was Schmaltz, and there was Saddle Ass, and Bottle Ass, and Fat Ass. There was cute names. And there was Fox, and Foxy, and there was Peanut, and there was Major, and there was Balls, and there was Rump, and there was Buckets, and there was Porky, and there was Crawler, and there was Cooney, and there was Marty, and there was Drainy, and then there was Arse, and there was Bert, and there was Tin, and then there was Smokey, and then there was Grease, and there was Meggs, M-E-G-G-S, and there was Old Bear, and then there are a couple of fellas that were known just by their initials. You'd know what they were talking about if somebody said these initials. There was H-H, there was C-H, there was P-H, there was C-A, C-R, A-W. Hi. Well, this morning I think I want to talk about something just a little bit different here that I meant to talk about at various times. It's about my grandmother, Teresa Hardees Dramberg. She was quite a pharmacist in her own right. She was a great believer in the old line of herbs. Now, she had found out about a lot of this stuff from her mother. And her mother had found out a lot about it from the Indian family that you heard about that the Hardeeses got to know when they first came to this country. And the Indian had a wife, and that lady used to come over and help the old Grandma Hardees, I suppose, with her kids. And she apparently showed her, or according to what my grandmother said, she showed her mother where some of these herbs and plants and things were that were good for medical reasons, because you couldn't go to a doctor, you couldn't get to a pharmacy, and so a lot of these people relied upon native items. Well, that's true in the world today. We have a lot of the medicines that we use in the modern world today that came out of nature, came from herbs, or they came from flowers or plants or seeds or animals. And the pharmacists today are searching the world for some probably item that would help in the fight for AIDS or cancer or muscular dystrophy or a lot of the other scourges that fill the earth. Well, anyway, I used to help my grandmother gather some of these things. Probably when I got to be maybe around 10 years old, I suppose, 10 to somewhere in that era around there. I remember going out there as late as when I was probably a freshman or a sophomore in high school, and she would go over to the woods, across the street, sometime in back Kowaleski's, other times over what she called Uncle Adolph's woods, that meant her brother, the old fire homestead. And across the railroad tracks, there was still some Dramberg property in there. And on this kind of higher land, where it wasn't swamp, she would gather these herbs. And what she did, we started out, I went with her, I walked with her. Now, you got to remember that she, at that time, about 1920 or so, she was one big woman. She probably weighed close to 300 pounds, and she was probably about 6'2" or 3". And she was as strong as an ox, but of course it was a hard job for her to bend down. And so we start out with a basket, and she had a shovel, small shovel, a small hatchet, and a knife, and I went with her. And we'd get to a certain place in the woods there, and then she would say, if we were speaking most of the time in German, now she said, "Get me that, break off those leaves of that little plant right there," and then she would point out which one it was, and she would take it in her hand, and then she would smell it, and she'd say, "Yeah, that's right." Now she said, cut off some of those branches there off of the plant. These were sometimes little shrubs, or sometimes it was the leaves, or she would say, "Dig that out." Well, I'd take the shovel and dig out these weren't big plants. These probably had a diameter of maybe a quarter of an inch, or some of them probably maybe 3/4 of an inch. So dig them out and bring out the whole thing, and then she would take a certain amount of that stuff along with the roots and put it into the basket. We'd move along a little further, and we would get some small. There were a lot of wild cherries in that area, some choke cherry and some red or pin cherry, and she would get some of this real small plants that she recognized that came up, and she wanted those dug out. She wanted some of the roots off of that. She wanted some of the bark off of the bigger branches off the wild cherry, and there was just a big assortment of things that she knew and recognized. Another thing I remember, that went further down into the swamp area, and then we looked around at the balsam and the spruce, or the pine, small pine, or juniper, or hemlock, and she would look for blisters on the trees, these pitch blisters that form on those evergreen trees. And and sometimes you got a glob about the size of a tennis ball. Other times they were small, but they were very pungent. As you know, they're very sticky. And she would kind of separate those, and then she would take a little of the leaf, the green leaf, and attach it to that gob, so that she knew whether that was juniper, or whether that was hemlock, or whether that was balsam, or whether that was spruce. This was gum. This was some little thing had happened. I suppose lightning had hit a tree or something, and it would create this ooze, and very pungent. And if you were a kid and tried it, you find out it's very bitter. Well, she gathered a lot of that stuff, and there were other things, of course, that I know that she had around the house. Around the house there, she had some plants that she had planted of wild chameleon tea, and she had some hops growing there, and the hop she just and then she had another flower, I think that they called it lavender. She had 4 or 5 things. This was just outside of the house. As you came in off the yard, right immediately to the right, there were some big cottonwood trees in there, and under that she had herbs that they just grew year after year after year, and somebody had a stomach problem, and she'd go out and gather some of that chameleon and make a tea out of it. But now, these various things, of course, now there are other things that she had. In her house, in the corner of the kitchen, on one of the shelves, there was a little area there, probably maybe about a yard long, probably about a little 8 inches wide, which was a shelf, and that was kind of her pharmacy, you might say. That was the drugstore. There were little containers in there. There were some glass, and there was some ceramic. There was some metal dishes in there, and after she had prepared a lot of these things, the way she prepared those things is that after we got home, she would clean them up. They were cleaned up thoroughly. They were washed. Some of the roots were, if she wanted something the right way, I suppose, but a lot of this stuff was cooked afterwards. Some of it was boiled. Some of that stuff from the roots was cut into very fine, almost sawdust pieces. And it was used in various ways for various things. She also collected such things as rose hips. You remember outside of the old home, there was a good plant, big wild rose bush there. I don't know whether wild or tame, but it covered probably 5 or 6 or 10, probably 10. It covered an area probably about 6 by 10 feet, and it was just loaded with wild roses. Well, those wild roses produce a kind of a little knob, you might say, and that was used for certain things. She also had some I was thinking of some of the other things that you gather there in the woods. Once in a while we ran into wild thorn apple. I don't know whether you know what wild thorn apple is not, but it produces a little apple about the size of a small walnut. And the thorns on that bush are real thorns. They're 1.5 inches, 2 inches long. They're sharp. I encountered it various times when I was duck hunting out in the woods. You run into these thorn apples. Boy, they just tear your pants right open. And then she used a lot of other things. She had some flowers, I think it would be related to the yarrow plant. It was yellow. And that served a certain person. You just took that up. I think it was used for nosebleed. And then there was a certain amount of wild mint. Now, I don't know what relationship that is to the domestic mint that they grow commercially, but it had a very, very minty flavor. Then she also gathered, I know, wintergreen. You and I have gathered wintergreen. Those beautiful shiny leaves with a little red berry. We chew on them very good. Well, there's a certain amount of oil in those things. And in that woods there over by Uncle Ed's, there were certain patches over there that were just loaded with that wintergreen. Well, we gathered a lot of that. And then some of that, of course, she also used for flavoring when she made homemade soap. And then there was certain burdock. Burdock was was used very commonly in the old days. I know my dad, George Grambua, said that they used it. Wild burdock was used. And a burdock root was used. And dandelion root was used. And then, of course, there were other items there. Even some of the things that they used in making these juniper berries for alcohol. Now, you got to remember that before 1920, you could buy alcohol, just as you could buy whiskey, but you could buy clear alcohol just like a druggist uses it today to mix medicines. And some of these people would go and just get a quart of alcohol, and with that alcohol, they sometimes flavored it to make their own particular liqueur, you might say, we call it today. That's the way they did that. Now, if you got some caraway seed, you boiled it up a little bit, got a little, it was very, very pleasant odor, and you mixed that with alcohol, and that was Kimmel. That's where your Kimmel is made. And Grandpa Dramberg, that was his favorite liqueur, was Kimmel. And then, of course, you could use the juniper, too. You could put that with alcohol or whiskey. And juniper, of course, is one of the chief ingredients in the flavor of gin. But these people knew that. These people were, somebody told them about it. That's what you might say. And so that's the way they did that. And there, of course, we do know that some of that stuff was used as a kind of a flavoring. And just like, for example, you take root beer. It's made out, some of the flavoring comes from the root. So I don't know just which plant it is. It's like sarsaparilla comes from a root. And birch beer comes from a root. And, I think modern Coca-Cola has first derivatives were out of roots, herbs, that some clever pharmacist down in, I think it was Atlanta, Georgia, discovered. Well, that's where a lot of that stuff came from. And these people knew this stuff. And then these things were prepared, and with a variety of other products. And they made salves, and they made poultices. Certain things, for example, like if you had a stomach condition, vomiting cramps, well, then you use chameleon tea. And it's a sedative, and it works. I remember having it out there. Now, you got to remember that as a kid, I spent an awful lot of time with my grandparents, Drambergs. That's because primarily my grandfather was with me for that long period of time in St. Louis, Missouri, and I guess I got very fond of him, and he got very fond of me. And we kept that thing up all through life, all the time that I was in college. I used to write him at least every 2 weeks I would write him a little letter, and he would write me, or he'd send me $5. And always very, very good to me. And so, as of course, in the summer times, I spent a lot of time out at the Grambua farm. Now, you could always tell when Grandma was cooking up something for a pharmacopoeia or a pharmacy. There were very sweet odors that came out of the kitchen. And she would use these herbs mixed with alcohol, or mixed with, some of them were mixed with vinegar, and some of them were mixed with beeswax. I know one of the salves that she had a beeswax base. And I remember that in the corner of the old shed, up in the ceiling, there was a large chunk of empty beeswax that she said that Uncle Carl had found out in some tree in the woods. That is, there was no honey in it, but the wax was there. And she would take a certain amount of that and melt it down, put it on top of a can of water, and the wax would melt and come to the top. And that was used for part of one of them I know was used for salve. Speaking about that salve, when Grandpa and I were in St. Louis, Missouri, of course there were drugstores around. There were drugstores in Rogers City at that time already, but Grandma kept on with her own remedies anyway. And I'll be darned if Grandpa Dramberg didn't write his wife and told him that he needed some of her salve. Son of a gun, in a couple of weeks, here comes a can of salve that he wanted, especially to put on when he got bruises or I got scrapes. I was always getting scraped up, of course, walking on crutches and falling down, playing ball, the rest of the kids, and soccer and football, like all the kids did. We had a gang of kids. They were at the hospital. They had a big playground, and there was always somebody getting scuffed up. And but that was just it. He could have just as well gone down to the corner drugstore and got some salve, but no, he sent home and got some of Grandma's salve. And but this stuff was made into a variety of products that you could hardly think of. They used it for colds. They used it for headaches. They for sore eyes, and they used it for poultice. They also sometimes mixed it with camphor or turpentine, or they mixed it with the tallow, and it was for cuts and bruises and infections and rashes, and for constipation, and for chapped hands, and for blisters. And then they had another. I remember this. I always intrigued about this one. We hear about the product lanolin that comes out of wool. Well, these people knew about that in the early days. Grandma Dramberg had several pieces of raw wool, that were they slaughtered sheep. They cleaned the inside of the hide, took off all flesh, so it was just absolutely clean, and that was thoroughly dried. And then, if you got very severe chapped hands, you just took that raw wool, it hadn't been clipped, and you just rubbed that, you ran your fingers back and forth through that raw wool, which was on this piece of dried skin. And of course, I guess it was very effective. And I remember actually seeing Aunt Gusty working her hands in that lanolin wool, which came right off of the sheep. And they, of course, if the lanolin that you buy in the store, of course, has been doctored up with certain other ingredients, but this was the stuff. Now, if you ever run your hand through raw wool, you will see that there's a certain amount of sheen there, a certain amount of grease that is on that wool. That's why it's waterproof. That's why they can go out in the rain. That's why they can go out in the snow. It doesn't soak in. So that is the ingredient that is very, very effective in treating chapped hands. And I recall that. But that I thought was very interesting. And then they also had certain things for earaches. They had certain things for boils. And then there were other items that I know that some of it was bought commercially and then used in conjunction with these other herbs. That was licorice. They used horehound. And some of this stuff that Grandma was made into a kind of a smelling salts. Some of that stuff was very, very pungent. You take some of those pitches or tars off of those trees, you get those up to your nose and smell them, and boy, they just take the top of your head right off. Well, I suppose that's the essence of smelling salts anyway. And then there were seeds of certain apple seeds. I don't know which apple that was called. I think it was a type of a crab apple. The seeds of that thing were supposed to be very effective for certain types of stomach ailment. And that stuff was used in making soap. They made a lot of soap. You know that our mother, Alma Grambua, made soap, which she flavored. And and some of it was, so that's the way that goes. Now, some of that stuff isn't so far off. You remember our Aunt Bertha, who was, of course, an RN, and she practiced her trade for some 60 years, if not more, in veterans hospitals, but at heart. She told me that she very, very seldom went to a doctor. She treated herself with some of the same old darn remedies that she had learned from her mother, but she could go to the drugstore and buy them. And as you remember, she was quite a naturalist in that respect. She was always chewing on something and sending our mother, Alma, a big box of goodies, of pits, and bark, ground up flowers, and everything else. And Mother and Dad would be going there, they'd be sitting and chewing that stuff. But Bertha believed that a lot of that stuff that came out of the modern pharmaceutical houses had too many other ingredients. There were not enough natural ingredients there that you could cure yourself. To that extent, you might say she was a little bit like a Christian Science. I don't know, just I know that she did belong to some religious group out there in California, but I don't know what it was. But she was, to a certain extent, had some of the same beliefs as Mrs. Eddy, who founded the Christian Science religion. So I just thought I'd mention that stuff because I saw so much of it, and I remember one time that Uncle Carl had got a very, very serious infection in his hand. Ooh, man, the thing was ugly. The hand was almost twice. And she wanted him to go to a doctor, and he didn't want to go. Well, she said, then I'll do what I can, and then if it isn't better by tomorrow, then you've got to go to the doctor. So she had a little knife. She had a little, almost like a very, very sharp knife that she had set aside special. And I remember she heated that knife with the steam. And then she had a certain poultice that she had made up. And this infection had a kind of a center to it. And she told him, well, now, this is going to hurt a little bit. And by gosh, I kind of watched it. I was intrigued what was going to happen. And this knife was very sharp. It was a part of an old razor blade. Not a razor blade, a man's single edged razor that they shaved with. Those things were very, very sharp. And by gosh, if she just didn't take that thing and just like a zip, and she made maybe a 2-inch cut right into his hand. And blood and gunk and their pus just rolled out of there. Well, of course, that's what she wanted. And then she gave him some tea, and she put a poultice on top of that very lightly. And there was some burdock in there, too, I know. And then just simply said, well, now, you just go to bed. You just stay here for today, and we'll see what will happen by tomorrow. And if by tomorrow that isn't better, we're going to the doctor. Either Alpena or Roger City. I suppose Roger City would have been the best, but he was sick. He was really sick. And I'll be darned, by the next morning that thing had drained out. Now, it wasn't all the way down to normal size, but it was very, very good. So she washed it right out. I forget what they used for antiseptic. They had some kind of an antiseptic that was very powerful smelling. I kind of think that maybe it was a derivative of carbolic acid or something like that, was mixed with water. And she washed that out in very, very hot water, put another shot of poultice on there, and wrapped it up again. And I would say that probably in a matter of maybe 4 or 5 days, Carl was back working. And I mean, he could. In the meantime, of course, she and now this was before. This was before Carl was married. I think Carl married about 1921 or 22. I think that's right, because I think Doris is about the same age as the twins in there. But Carl wasn't married at that time yet. He and Grandpa and Grandma were running the farm, and of course, when Grandpa was in St. Louis with me, Grandma and Carl ran the farm. Grandma wasn't the farmer. She knew how to handle the farm. She could handle the horses and the plows and the binders and the whole darn thing. But of course, she was a big, big, strong, powerful woman. And Grandpa Gramberg, as you know, was kind of a frail man by comparison. But so much for the pharmacopoeia. But I just thought I should bring that in there because I often thought of it afterwards. You can go down to the drugstore and buy yourself a can of salve, and still he sent a letter, told Ma to send him some salve because he needed salve for bruises down in St. Louis, Missouri. And also, I do know this. I told you before that the place that we stayed was owned by a Dr. Carter, who was an M.D. And I know that on several occasions that Dr. Carter did take a look at some of the people that were in his home. His wife ran the room and boarding house. And I'm sure that had he come in or gone in and asked him to, get a prescription for salve, there would have been nothing to it. But no, you got to do things the old way. Well, I guess that's enough for that today. Thank you.